sometimes the smallest symbols carry the greatest weight. In a world where first impressions can destroy lives or transform them, one young woman discovered that the jewelry around her neck held more power than any uniform or title ever could. What started as another day of workplace harassment would end with a revelation that changed everything, proving that heroes don't always wear capes, and sometimes the most unlikely encounters can restore faith in humanity. Sarah Martinez adjusted the small pendant hanging from her neck as she walked through the bustling corridors of Fort Braxton Military Base. The tiny silver trident caught the fluorescent lights above, glinting briefly before disappearing beneath her administrative uniform collar. At 24, she had learned to keep her head down and her voice quiet, especially around certain people who seemed to take pleasure in making her life difficult. The morning started like any other Tuesday. Sarah arrived at her desk in the personnel office 30 minutes early, as was her habit. She preferred the quiet moments before the chaos of the day began, when she could organize files and prepare for whatever challenges lay ahead. Her workspace was immaculate, every pen in its place, every document sorted with military precision that would have made any drill sergeant proud. Well, look who's trying to impress someone again," came a familiar voice from behind her. Sarah's shoulders tensed as Staff Sergeant Rebecca Collins approached with her usual group of followers. Rebecca was everything Sarah was not: tall, confident, and seemingly untouchable within the base's social hierarchy. She had made it her personal mission to ensure Sarah knew exactly where she stood in the pecking order. "Good morning, Staff Sergeant Collins," Sarah replied politely, not turning around from her computer screen. She had learned that acknowledging Rebecca's presence while avoiding eye contact was the safest approach. Any sign of defiance or disrespect could make the situation exponentially worse. "Don't give me that fake politeness," Rebecca sneered, moving closer to Sarah's desk. "You think coming in early makes you special? You think anyone here actually cares about your little kiss-up routine?" The other women behind her snickered, emboldened by their leader's cruel confidence. Sarah's fingers found her pendant instinctively, a nervous habit she had developed over the past 6 months since Rebecca's campaign against her had intensified. The small piece of jewelry had belonged to her older brother, and wearing it gave her strength during moments like these. She took a deep breath and continued typing, hoping that ignoring the taunts would make Rebecca lose interest and move on to torment someone else. But Rebecca wasn't finished. She leaned over Sarah's shoulder, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You know what I think? I think you're here under false pretenses. I think someone pulled strings to get you this position, because there's no way someone like you earned it on merit." Her words were carefully chosen, designed to cut deep while remaining just vague enough to avoid official reprimand. The accusation stung because it played on Sarah's deepest insecurities. She had worked twice as hard as anyone else to earn her position, studying late into the night and volunteering for every additional duty that came her way. But Rebecca's constant undermining had begun to make her question her own worth and abilities. "I earned my position just like everyone else," Sarah said quietly, finally, turning to face her tormentor. It was a mistake. The moment she made eye contact, Rebecca's expression shifted to something more predatory. "Did you now?" Rebecca's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you're nothing more than a diversity hire who doesn't belong here. Maybe it's time someone reminded you of that fact." The threat was unmistakable, and Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she realized the situation was escalating beyond the usual verbal harassment. The other women in Rebecca's group began to circle closer, creating a barrier between Sarah and the rest of the office. Most of her co-workers had arrived by now, but they were either too intimidated by Rebecca's rank and reputation to intervene, or they simply didn't want to become targets themselves. Sarah understood their reluctance, but the isolation made her feel even more vulnerable. "Listen carefully," Rebecca continued, her voice now loud enough for others to hear but still maintaining a tone that could be dismissed as friendly conversation by any passing superior. "You have 2 choices. You can request a transfer to another base, preferably somewhere far from here, or you can continue to make everyone's life difficult with your presence. I think we both know which option would be better for everyone involved." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. This wasn't just bullying anymore, it was a direct attempt to force her out of her position and off the base entirely. She thought about her brother, who had served multiple tours overseas and had always told her to stand up for herself. She thought about her parents, who had sacrificed so much to give her opportunities they never had. She thought about all the late nights studying and all the extra hours she had put in to prove herself worthy of wearing the uniform. "I'm not going anywhere," Sarah said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I have every right to be here, and I'm going to do my job regardless of how you feel about it." The words came out before she could stop them, and she immediately regretted her moment of defiance. Rebecca's face darkened with anger. "Wrong answer," she hissed. "You just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic little career." She stepped back and addressed her followers. "It looks like our friend here needs a more persuasive demonstration of how things work around here. Why don't we help her understand?" The group began to close in, their intentions clear. Sarah looked around desperately for help, but everyone else in the office had suddenly become very interested in their computer screens and paperwork. She was truly alone, facing a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. Her hand went to her pendant again, seeking comfort in the small piece of silver that connected her to her brother's memory and his courage. What Sarah didn't know was that at that very moment, General Patricia Hawthorne was making an unscheduled visit to the personnel office. The general had a reputation for surprise inspections and informal check-ins with her troops, believing that the true measure of a unit's effectiveness could only be observed when people thought no one important was watching. She had entered through a side door and was approaching the main office area when she heard the commotion. General Hawthorne was not a woman to be trifled with. At 52, she had fought her way through every rank in the military at a time when women in combat roles were rare. She had commanded respect through competence, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to protecting those under her command. She had also learned to recognize the signs of abuse and harassment, having faced plenty of it herself during her early years of service. As she rounded the corner, she could see a group of women surrounding a desk where someone was clearly in distress. The body language was unmistakable. This was not a friendly conversation or a work-related discussion. This was intimidation, pure and simple, and it was happening on her base under her command. "What exactly is going on here?" General Hawthorne's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Every person in the office immediately snapped to attention, including Rebecca and her group. The sudden appearance of the base's commanding officer had transformed the atmosphere completely. Rebecca quickly tried to regain her composure and take control of the narrative. "General Hawthorne, ma'am. We were just having a friendly discussion with Martinez here about work responsibilities. Nothing that requires your attention, I assure you." Her voice was smooth and confident, the voice of someone accustomed to talking her way out of difficult situations. But General Hawthorne had not risen to her position by being easily fooled. She could see the fear in Sarah's eyes, the aggressive positioning of Rebecca's group, and the way everyone else in the office was carefully avoiding eye contact. The situation was crystal clear to anyone with experience reading human behavior and group dynamics. "Is that so?" General Hawthorne replied, her tone suggesting she didn't believe a word of Rebecca's explanation. "Martinez, step forward." Sarah obeyed immediately, grateful for the intervention but terrified about what might happen next. She had heard stories about soldiers who reported harassment only to face even worse retaliation afterward. As Sarah moved closer, General Hawthorne noticed something that made her pause. There, partially visible above the collar of Sarah's uniform, was a small silver pendant. It was barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for, but General Hawthorne's trained eye recognized the distinctive shape immediately. It was a seal trident, the sacred symbol worn only by those who had completed the most grueling military training in the world. General Hawthorne's expression shifted subtly, though she maintained her professional composure. She had served alongside Navy SEALs in multiple theaters of operation and had developed a deep respect for the brotherhood they represented. She also knew that the trident was not something worn casually or without meaning. Someone had given this young woman that pendant, and, given the reverent way she touched it when stressed, it clearly held significant emotional value. "Martinez," General Hawthorne said, her voice taking on a different tone, still authoritative, but with an underlying warmth that hadn't been there before. "That's an interesting piece of jewelry you're wearing." Does it have special significance? The question was asked in a way that gave Sarah permission to share without forcing her to reveal anything she wasn't comfortable discussing. Sarah's hand instinctively went to the pendant, her fingers closing around the small piece of silver. She hesitated, unsure whether revealing its origin would help or hurt her situation. Rebecca and her group were watching intently, probably assuming this was just another way for the general to find fault with Sarah's appearance or adherence to uniform regulations. "It belonged to my brother, ma'am," Sarah said quietly. "He served in Afghanistan before." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The pain was still too fresh, even after 2 years. Marcus had been her hero, her protector, and her inspiration to serve her country. Losing him had nearly broken her, and wearing his trident was the only way she could feel close to him anymore. General Hawthorne's expression softened almost imperceptibly. She understood immediately what Sarah couldn't bring herself to say. Too many good soldiers hadn't made it home from that conflict, and the families they left behind carried scars that never fully healed. The fact that this young woman was honoring her fallen brother by wearing his trident spoke volumes about her character and her reasons for serving. "Your brother was Navy?" General Hawthorne asked gently, though she already knew the answer. The trident told its own story: years of training, sacrifice, and service to something greater than oneself. It represented a brotherhood forged in the crucible of combat and sealed with blood, sweat, and unwavering commitment to protecting others. "Yes, ma'am." Petty Officer First Class Marcus Martinez, SEAL Team 6, Sarah replied, pride evident in her voice despite her emotional state. "He always said the military was about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. That's why I wanted to serve too, even if I'm just in administration." Her words carried the weight of loss and the determination to honor her brother's memory through her own service. The office had gone completely silent. Rebecca and her followers were beginning to realize that this conversation had taken a turn they hadn't anticipated. What they had assumed would be a routine dressing down of their target was transforming into something else entirely. General Hawthorne's demeanor had shifted from stern authority to something approaching reverence, and they couldn't understand why. General Hawthorne studied Sarah's face, seeing past the fear and uncertainty to the strength underneath. She recognized the look of someone who had faced real loss and had chosen to honor it through service rather than surrender to bitterness or despair. It was a look she had seen in mirrors during her own darkest moments, when the weight of command and the cost of war had threatened to crush her spirit. "SEAL Team 6, General Hawthorne repeated, her voice carrying a note of deep respect. "Your brother was part of something very special. The men and women who earn the right to wear that trident represent the absolute best of what our military can produce. They don't just fight for their country, they fight for their teammates, their families, and people they'll never meet who depend on them for protection." Sarah nodded, tears threatening to spill over as she thought about Marcus and all the stories he had shared during his brief leaves home. He had never talked about the details of his missions, but he had spoken passionately about the bond between teammates and the responsibility they felt to protect innocent people around the world. His death had robbed the world of someone truly exceptional, and Sarah carried that knowledge like a sacred trust. Rebecca was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. This wasn't supposed to be happening. Sarah was supposed to be the weak link, the easy target who could be pushed around without consequences. The general's obvious respect for Sarah's family history was threatening to undermine everything Rebecca had worked to establish. She decided to try to regain control of the situation. "General, ma'am, I think we're getting off track here," Rebecca interjected, her voice carefully modulated to sound reasonable and professional. "We still have work responsibilities to discuss, and I wouldn't want to take up any more of your valuable time with personal matters." She was hoping to redirect the conversation back to official business, where she felt more confident about maintaining her advantage. General Hawthorne turned her attention back to Rebecca, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Staff Sergeant Collins, you're absolutely right. We do need to discuss work responsibilities. Specifically, I want to understand exactly what kind of friendly discussion requires 5 people to surround one person at their desk." Her voice had returned to its command tone, and Rebecca suddenly realized she was walking into a trap. The general continued, her eyes never leaving Rebecca's face. In my experience, friendly discussions happen between equals, in neutral spaces, during appropriate times. What I observed when I walked in here looked more like intimidation and harassment. Would you care to explain the discrepancy? The question was phrased as a request, but everyone in the office understood it was actually an order. Rebecca's confident facade began to crack as she searched for a response that wouldn't incriminate her further. She had been so focused on tormenting Sarah that she hadn't considered how her actions might appear to a superior officer. Now, with General Hawthorne's penetrating stare boring into her, she realized she had made a serious tactical error. "Ma'am, I think there may have been a misunderstanding," Rebecca said, her voice less steady than before. "We were simply discussing work procedures and efficiency improvements. Martinez has been struggling with some of her assignments, and we were offering assistance." It was a weak explanation, and they all knew it. General Hawthorne's expression remained neutral, but Sarah could see a dangerous glint in her eyes. "Is that so? Martinez, would you say that's an accurate description of what was happening here?" The general was giving Sarah an opportunity to tell her side of the story, but she was also putting her in an incredibly difficult position. Sarah found herself at a crossroads that would define the rest of her military career. She could stay silent, accept Rebecca's version of events, and hope the situation would improve on its own. Or she could tell the truth and risk facing even worse retaliation later. Her fingers found her brother's trident again, and she could almost hear his voice telling her to stand up for herself and for others who couldn't defend themselves. "No, ma'am, that's not accurate," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "Staff Sergeant Collins and her group have been harassing me for months. They've questioned my qualifications, suggested I don't belong here, and today they threatened to force me off the base if I didn't request a transfer." The words tumbled out before she could second-guess herself, and she felt a strange sense of relief at finally speaking the truth. The office erupted in shocked whispers as Sarah's accusation hung in the air. Rebecca's face went pale as she realized the serious nature of the charges being leveled against her. Harassment and threats against fellow service members were career-ending offenses, especially when witnessed by a commanding general. General Hawthorne's face remained impassive, but those who knew her well would have recognized the subtle tightening around her eyes that indicated she was furious. She had spent decades fighting against exactly the kind of behavior Sarah was describing, and it infuriated her to discover it was happening under her own command. The fact that it was being directed at someone who carried such a personal connection to the SEAL community made it even more unacceptable. "Staff Sergeant Collins," General Hawthorne said, her voice deadly calm, "you and your associates will report to my office in 30 minutes. We're going to have a very detailed conversation about military conduct and professional standards." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Martinez, you'll join us 15 minutes after they arrive. I want to hear your full account of these alleged incidents." Rebecca's face had gone from pale to ashen. She understood that her military career was now hanging by a thread, and any chance of salvaging it depended on her next words and actions. "General, I believe there's been a serious misunderstanding. Perhaps we could resolve this matter at a lower level, without involving formal procedures." She was essentially begging for mercy, though trying to maintain some dignity in the process. "The time for informal resolution has passed," General Hawthorne replied curtly. "When harassment becomes threats, it becomes my direct concern." She turned her attention back to Sarah. "Martinez, are there any witnesses to these incidents? Anyone else who can corroborate your account?" The general was already thinking like an investigator, building a case that would stand up to scrutiny. Sarah hesitated, glancing around the office at her co-workers. Most of them were still staring at their computers, desperately trying to avoid eye contact. She understood their position, speaking up could make them targets as well. But she also knew that some of them had witnessed at least parts of Rebecca's campaign against her. "Corporal Thompson saw some of it," Sarah said quietly, nodding toward a young man near the back of the office. "And Specialist Lee was there when Staff Sergeant Collins made comments about my qualifications last week." Both soldiers looked up in surprise and obvious discomfort at being named, but they didn't deny her statements. General Hawthorne made mental notes of the names. Thompson, Lee, you'll also report to my office this afternoon. I want statements from anyone who witnessed or was aware of this alleged harassment. Her tone made it clear that failure to comply or attempts to lie would have serious consequences for their own careers. The general then addressed the entire office. Let me be crystal clear about something. Harassment, discrimination, and intimidation have no place in this military or on this base. Anyone who engages in such behavior will face the full consequences of military justice. Anyone who witnesses such behavior and fails to report it is equally culpable. Her words carried the weight of absolute authority. She turned back to Rebecca and her group. You have 29 minutes to prepare your statements. I suggest you use that time to reflect very carefully on your actions and their consequences. Dismissed. The dismissal was crisp and final, leaving no room for argument or delay. As Rebecca and her followers filed out of the office, the atmosphere began to shift. Some of Sarah's co-workers offered her supportive glances, while others seemed worried about being caught up in the investigation. Sarah herself felt a mixture of relief and terror, relief at finally being heard, but terror about what might happen next. General Hawthorne remained behind, studying Sarah with new interest. The young woman had shown considerable courage in speaking up against her tormentors, especially considering the potential for retaliation. That kind of moral backbone was exactly what the military needed more of, and the general was beginning to see why Sarah's brother had been drawn to service. Martinez, General Hawthorne said, her tone becoming more conversational, tell me about your brother. What was he like? The question seemed to come from genuine curiosity rather than official inquiry, and Sarah found herself relaxing slightly despite the stressful circumstances. Marcus was everything I wanted to be, Sarah began, her voice growing stronger as she spoke about her brother. He was brave, but not reckless. Smart, but not arrogant. He cared about people, really cared. When he came home on leave, he'd spend hours with local kids, teaching them about discipline and respect. He said the military had given him purpose, and he wanted to share that with others. General Hawthorne nodded, recognizing the description of a true warrior, someone who fought not out of aggression or anger, but out of love for others and commitment to principles larger than himself. How did he earn his trident? That's not an easy path. She was genuinely interested in Marcus's story, but she was also learning more about Sarah's background and motivations. Sarah's face lit up with pride as she remembered her brother's achievement. He always said it was the hardest thing he'd ever done. 6 months of training that pushed him beyond every limit he thought he had. He lost 30 pounds, broke 2 ribs, and nearly quit a dozen times. But, he said every time he wanted to give up, he thought about the people counting on him to succeed. The general could hear the admiration and love in Sarah's voice, but also the underlying pain of loss. When did you lose him? She asked gently, though she was already dreading the answer. Too many families had paid the ultimate price for their country's conflicts. 2 years ago, Sarah replied, her voice growing quiet again. IED attack during a rescue mission. He and his team were extracting hostages when the explosion happened. 3 of them didn't make it home. The pain was still raw, evident in every word she spoke. The commanding officer said Marcus died protecting others, just like he lived. General Hawthorne felt a familiar weight in her chest, the grief that never fully disappeared when good soldiers were lost. She had delivered too many death notifications and attended too many military funerals over her career. Each loss was personal, but something about Sarah's story struck her particularly deeply. Is that why you enlisted? To honor his memory? The question was asked with the understanding that family legacy often played a significant role in military service. Many of the best soldiers she had known were following in the footsteps of relatives who had served with distinction. Partly, Sarah admitted. But also because he taught me that service means something. He used to say that freedom isn't free, and if good people don't stand up to protect it, then bad people will take it away from those who can't protect themselves. I wanted to be part of that protection, even if I'm not in combat like he was. The general studied Sarah's face as she spoke, seeing the genuine commitment behind her words. This wasn't someone seeking glory or adventure, this was someone driven by a deep sense of duty and love for others. It was exactly the kind of motivation that made for excellent soldiers, regardless of their specific role or assignment. Administrative work is just as important as combat operations, General Hawthorne said firmly. Without people like you handling personnel, logistics, and support functions, the combat troops couldn't do their jobs effectively. Every role matters, and every person who serves with integrity contributes to our mission. She wanted Sarah to understand that her contribution was valued and necessary. Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at the general's words. For months, Rebecca's constant undermining had made her question her worth and place in the military. To hear such validation from someone of General Hawthorne's stature was both encouraging and humbling. "Thank you, ma'am. That means more than you know." The general glanced at her watch and realized she had spent more time in the personnel office than she had planned. But this conversation had been more valuable than most of her scheduled meetings. She had not only uncovered a serious harassment problem, but had also discovered a soldier whose character and dedication reminded her why she had chosen to serve in the first place. "I need to prepare for our meeting this afternoon," General Hawthorne said, transitioning back to official business. "But I want you to know that speaking up took courage, and I respect that. Whatever happens next, you did the right thing by reporting this situation." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "Your brother would be proud of you." Sarah felt tears threatening again, but they were tears of gratitude rather than pain. "Thank you, General. That means everything to me." She had spent so long wondering if she was living up to Marcus's example, and to hear that affirmation from someone who clearly understood military service was profoundly meaningful. After General Hawthorne left the office, Sarah found herself the center of attention in a way she had never experienced before. Some of her co-workers approached her with words of support, admitting that they had been afraid to speak up but admired her courage in doing so. Others maintained their distance, perhaps worried about potential complications or simply uncomfortable with workplace drama. Corporal Thompson was the first to approach her directly. "Martinez, I want you to know that I'll tell the truth about what I saw," he said quietly. "Collins and her crew were way out of line, and it's been bothering me for weeks that I didn't say anything sooner." His admission carried the weight of personal regret and professional responsibility. Specialist Lee joined them, looking nervous but determined. "Same here. I've been keeping my head down because I didn't want to become a target, but that was cowardly. You shouldn't have had to face that alone." Her words reflected the moral struggle many soldiers faced when witnessing injustice but feeling powerless to intervene. Sarah felt a growing sense of support that she hadn't experienced since her brother's death. For the first time in months, she wasn't facing her challenges completely alone. "Thank you both," she said sincerely. "I know it's not easy to get involved in something like this, but it means a lot to know you'll tell the truth." As the morning progressed, word of the confrontation began to spread throughout the base. Military installations were essentially small communities where news traveled fast, and the sight of General Hawthorne conducting an impromptu investigation had not gone unnoticed. Various versions of the story circulated, some accurate and others wildly exaggerated, but all centered on the dramatic shift in Sarah's circumstances. In the base commissary during lunch break, conversations buzzed with speculation about what would happen to Rebecca and her group. Some soldiers expressed satisfaction that someone had finally stood up to what many considered bullying behavior. Others worried about the precedent it might set and the potential for increased scrutiny of interpersonal relationships throughout the command structure. Meanwhile, Rebecca was experiencing the isolation that comes with being on the wrong side of a military investigation. Her usual supporters were keeping their distance, unwilling to risk their own careers by association. She found herself eating lunch alone, contemplating the rapid deterioration of her position and influence on the base. Her thoughts kept returning to the moment when everything had changed, when General Hawthorne had noticed Sarah's pendant and the entire dynamic of the situation had shifted. Rebecca couldn't understand what was so special about a piece of jewelry, but she recognized that it had somehow elevated Sarah's status in the general's eyes. What she didn't understand was the sacred significance of the seal trident and the profound respect it commanded from those who truly understood military service. As the afternoon approached, both Sarah and Rebecca prepared for what would likely be the most important meetings of their military careers. For Sarah, it was an opportunity to finally tell her complete story to someone with the authority and willingness to act on it. For Rebecca, it was a desperate attempt to salvage her career and avoid the serious consequences that seemed increasingly inevitable. General Hawthorne spent her lunch hour reviewing military regulations regarding harassment, discrimination, and conduct unbecoming. She also made several phone calls to colleagues who had worked with SEAL units, seeking to better understand the culture and values that Sarah's brother had represented. What she learned only reinforced her initial assessment of the situation and strengthened her resolve to handle it appropriately. The afternoon meeting would prove to be a turning point not just for Sarah and Rebecca, but for the entire base culture. General Hawthorne understood that how she handled this situation would send a message to every soldier under her command about what behavior would and would not be tolerated. She intended to make that message unmistakably clear. As the appointed time approached, Sarah found herself thinking about Marcus and drawing strength from his memory. He had always told her that doing the right thing was rarely easy, but it was always worth it. Standing up to Rebecca and her group had been the hardest thing she had done since enlisting, but she knew her brother would have been proud of her courage. The next few hours would determine not only her future in the military, but also whether justice would prevail over intimidation and harassment. Sarah touched her brother's trident one more time, feeling the familiar sense of connection and purpose it provided. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the same courage and integrity that Marcus had shown throughout his life and service. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything, and Sarah was ready to play her part in ensuring that the truth finally came to light. General Hawthorne's office was a study in military efficiency and personal history. The walls were lined with commendations, photographs from various deployments, and mementos from her decades of service. Behind her desk hung a large American flag, and to its right was a smaller flag from her first command. The room spoke of dedication, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to the principles of military service. Rebecca Collins and her 3 followers sat rigidly in chairs arranged in front of the general's desk. The 15 minutes they had spent waiting had felt like hours, each woman lost in her own thoughts about how drastically their situation had deteriorated in just a few hours. The confident swagger they had displayed that morning was completely gone, replaced by the nervous tension of soldiers who knew they were in serious trouble. "Before we begin," General Hawthorne said as she settled behind her desk, "I want to make something absolutely clear. This is an official investigation into allegations of harassment and misconduct. Everything said in this room will be documented and may be used in formal disciplinary proceedings. You have the right to request legal counsel, though given the preliminary nature of these discussions, I don't anticipate that being necessary at this time." Rebecca straightened in her chair, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "General, I want to assure you that any perceived misconduct was purely unintentional. We've always maintained professional relationships with all personnel, including Martinez. If our interactions have been misinterpreted, I deeply regret that misunderstanding." General Hawthorne's expression remained neutral, but internally she was already forming opinions about Rebecca's character based on her choice to deflect responsibility rather than accept accountability. "Staff Sergeant Collins, before we discuss interpretations and misunderstandings, I want to hear your version of this morning's events. Start from the beginning and tell me exactly what happened." Rebecca launched into a carefully crafted narrative that portrayed her actions as legitimate supervisory guidance and professional development. According to her version, she had merely been offering constructive feedback about work performance and suggesting ways Sarah could better integrate with the team. She characterized the gathering around Sarah's desk as a collaborative discussion about improving office efficiency. As Rebecca spoke, General Hawthorne took detailed notes while observing the body language of the other women. She noticed that while Rebecca maintained eye contact and spoke confidently, her followers seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the version of events being presented. Their nervous glances and fidgeting suggested they knew the truth was being distorted significantly. Specialist Warren, General Hawthorne said, turning her attention to one of Rebecca's followers, do you agree with Staff Sergeant Collins's description of this morning's events? The question was asked in a tone that made it clear she expected an honest answer, not a rehearsed response. Specialist Warren shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly caught between loyalty to Rebecca and fear of lying to a commanding general. Ma'am, the conversation was more intense than Staff Sergeant Collins is describing. There were some harsh words exchanged, and Martinez seemed pretty upset by the end of it. Rebecca shot Warren a sharp look, but the damage was already done. General Hawthorne had identified a crack in the unified front, and she intended to explore it further. Harsh words? Can you be more specific about what was said and who said it? Warren glanced nervously between Rebecca and the general, understanding that her next words could end friendships and damage careers. But she also understood that lying to a general officer during an official investigation could end her own military career permanently. Staff Sergeant Collins told Martinez that she didn't belong here and should request a transfer. She also questioned whether Martinez had earned her position legitimately. The office fell silent as the weight of Warren's admission settled over everyone present. Rebecca's face flushed with anger and embarrassment at being contradicted by one of her own supporters. The other two women in her group seemed to shrink deeper into their chairs, realizing that their involvement in the morning's events was about to be exposed in detail. Thank you for your honesty, Specialist Warren, General Hawthorne said, her tone indicating both approval and expectation that such honesty would continue. Corporal Hayes, Corporal Mitchell, do you have anything to add to Specialist Warren's account? Corporal Hayes spoke up first, her voice barely above a whisper. Ma'am, Staff Sergeant Collins did suggest that Martinez should leave the base. She said it would be better for everyone involved if Martinez requested a transfer to another installation. The admission was delivered reluctantly, but it corroborated Warren's testimony and further undermined Rebecca's carefully constructed narrative. Corporal Mitchell nodded in agreement. Yes, ma'am. And there were comments about Martinez being a diversity hire who didn't earn her position on merit. I didn't feel comfortable with some of the things being said, but I didn't know how to speak up without causing problems. Her words carried the weight of moral regret and professional confusion. General Hawthorne had heard enough to confirm that Sarah's allegations were credible and that Rebecca had been deliberately misrepresenting the facts. The pattern was clear: systematic harassment designed to force a transfer through intimidation and psychological pressure. It was exactly the kind of behavior she had sworn to eliminate from her command. Staff Sergeant Collins, General Hawthorne said, her voice taking on a harder edge, your subordinates have just contradicted several key aspects of your initial statement. Would you care to revise your account of this morning's events? The question was phrased as an opportunity for Rebecca to show some integrity by telling the truth, but it was also a final warning before more serious consequences began. Rebecca realized that her position was becoming increasingly untenable, but she wasn't ready to admit defeat. General, I may have spoken more firmly than necessary about performance issues, but my intentions were always professional. Martinez has struggled with certain aspects of her duties, and I was trying to provide guidance that would help her succeed. It was another attempt to minimize her actions while shifting some blame to Sarah. What specific performance issues? General Hawthorne asked sharply. I've reviewed Martinez's personnel file, and her performance evaluations have been consistently satisfactory or above average. Her supervisors have noted her punctuality, attention to detail, and willingness to take on additional responsibilities. Where exactly has she struggled? Rebecca hadn't expected the general to have already reviewed Sarah's file, and she found herself scrambling for specific examples that would justify her claims. Well, there have been concerns about her integration with the team and her ability to work collaboratively on group projects, she said vaguely, hoping generalities would suffice. From whom have these concerns been raised? General Hawthorne pressed. Can you provide specific incidents or documented complaints about Martinez's teamwork or collaboration? She was systematically dismantling Rebecca's justifications by demanding concrete evidence for vague accusations. The truth was that no such concerns existed in Sarah's official record because Rebecca's harassment had been carefully designed to avoid formal documentation. It was a campaign of psychological pressure and social isolation that left few official fingerprints but caused significant personal damage. Now, faced with demands for specific evidence, Rebecca was discovering the weakness of her position. At that moment, there was a knock on the office door. "Enter," General Hawthorne called, and Sarah walked in, looking nervous but determined. She had changed from her work uniform into her dress uniform, and the seal trident was clearly visible above her left chest pocket. The sight of it reminded everyone in the room of the stakes involved and the deeper meaning behind the morning's confrontation. "Martinez, please take a seat," General Hawthorne said, gesturing to a chair position where Sarah could see everyone present. "I've been hearing various accounts of this morning's incident, and now I'd like to hear your complete version of events. Take your time and include any relevant background information that might help me understand the full scope of the situation." Sarah took a deep breath and began to tell her story from the beginning. She described months of subtle harassment, undermining comments, and social isolation orchestrated by Rebecca and her group. She detailed specific incidents where her qualifications had been questioned, her work had been criticized unfairly, and her presence on the base had been characterized as illegitimate or inappropriate. As Sarah spoke, her voice grew stronger and more confident. She had lived with this harassment for so long that finally, being able to describe it openly was both liberating and validating. She provided specific dates, locations, and witnesses when possible, painting a picture of systematic misconduct that had escalated over time. "The worst part wasn't the comments about my work," Sarah explained. "It was the constant suggestion that I didn't earn my position, that someone had pulled strings to get me here. My brother always taught me that respect had to be earned through hard work and integrity. To have that questioned constantly, especially by people who didn't know anything about my background or qualifications, was devastating." General Hawthorne listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions or requesting additional details about specific incidents. She was building a comprehensive picture of behavior that went far beyond a single morning's confrontation. This was a pattern of harassment that had been allowed to continue for months, causing significant personal and professional damage to a dedicated soldier. "Martinez, why didn't you report this harassment sooner?" the general asked. It wasn't an accusation, but rather an attempt to understand the systemic factors that had allowed the situation to persist unchecked. Sarah hesitated, glancing briefly at Rebecca before answering. "Ma'am, Staff Sergeant Collins is well respected in our unit, and she was careful to make her comments seem like professional guidance or friendly advice. When it was just her word against mine, I didn't think anyone would believe me. And I was afraid that filing a complaint might make the situation worse or result in retaliation that could end my military career." The admission highlighted one of the most insidious aspects of workplace harassment, the way it often operated in shadows, using plausible deniability and fear of retaliation to silence victims. General Hawthorne recognized the pattern from her own experiences and from cases she had handled throughout her career. It was precisely the kind of behavior that required strong leadership and clear consequences to prevent. That fear of retaliation is exactly why we have strict policies against harassment and why I take these allegations so seriously, General Hawthorne said firmly. No soldier should have to endure hostile behavior or feel afraid to report it through proper channels. When those systems fail, it's my responsibility to ensure they're corrected immediately. She turned her attention back to Rebecca and her group. "Based on what I've heard this afternoon, it's clear that there are serious discrepancies between the various accounts of recent events. More importantly, there's credible evidence of a pattern of harassment and misconduct that violates both military regulations and basic standards of professional behavior." Rebecca made one final attempt to minimize the situation. "General, if my leadership style has been misinterpreted or has caused unintended offense, I'm willing to adjust my approach and work toward better communication with all team members. Perhaps some additional training or mediation could resolve these issues without formal disciplinary action." General Hawthorne's expression hardened at Rebecca's continued refusal to accept full responsibility for her actions. "Staff Sergeant Collins, this isn't about leadership style or communication preferences. This is about harassment, intimidation, and conduct unbecoming of a non-commissioned officer. The evidence indicates a deliberate pattern of behavior designed to force a subordinate to request a transfer through psychological pressure and professional undermining. The general stood and moved to the window, looking out at the base where hundreds of soldiers were going about their daily duties. Each of those soldiers deserved to serve in an environment free from harassment and discrimination. Allowing Rebecca's behavior to go unpunished would send the wrong message to everyone under her command. "Here's what's going to happen," General Hawthorne said, turning back to face the group. "There will be a formal investigation into these allegations, conducted by the Inspector General's office. During that investigation, Staff Sergeant Collins will be relieved of supervisory duties and placed on administrative assignment pending the outcome. The three of you," she said, addressing Rebecca's followers, "will also be interviewed formally and may face disciplinary action depending on your level of participation in this harassment." Rebecca's face went pale as the full implications of the general's decision sank in. Relief from supervisory duties was often the first step toward more serious disciplinary action, including potential court-martial proceedings. Her military career, which she had thought was secure just hours earlier, was now in serious jeopardy. "Martinez," General Hawthorne continued, "you'll be assigned a victim's advocate from the JAG office to ensure your rights are protected throughout this process. I also want you to know that there will be zero tolerance for retaliation in any form. Anyone who attempts to punish you for reporting this harassment will face immediate and severe consequences." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at the general's decision. She was grateful that her complaints were being taken seriously, but she also understood that the formal investigation would likely be stressful and time-consuming. Still, for the first time in months, she felt like someone was truly looking out for her interests and protecting her right to serve without harassment. "There's one more thing," General Hawthorne said, her tone becoming more personal. "Martinez, I want you to know that your brother's sacrifice and your family's service to this country are deeply respected. The fact that you've chosen to honor his memory through your own service, despite facing significant challenges, speaks volumes about your character and commitment." The general paused, looking directly at the seal trident on Sarah's uniform. That symbol represents more than just military achievement. It represents brotherhood, sacrifice, and an unbreakable commitment to protecting others. Your brother earned the right to wear it through dedication and courage, and you honor it through your own service and integrity. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes at the general's words. For months, Rebecca's harassment had made her question whether she truly belonged in the military or whether she was somehow dishonoring her brother's memory through her struggles. To hear such validation from someone of General Hawthorne's stature was profoundly meaningful. As the meeting concluded and everyone prepared to leave, General Hawthorne pulled Sarah aside for a private word. "I want you to remember something important," she said quietly. "Standing up to harassment and injustice is never easy, but it's necessary. By speaking up today, you've not only protected your own rights, but you've also protected future soldiers who might have become targets if this behavior had been allowed to continue." Sarah nodded, understanding the broader implications of her decision to report Rebecca's harassment. "Thank you, General. My brother always said that protecting others was the most important part of military service. I hope I've lived up to that standard today." General Hawthorne smiled, seeing in Sarah the same qualities that had undoubtedly driven her brother to excel in his military service. "You have, Martinez. You absolutely have. Your brother would be very proud of the soldier you've become and the courage you've shown today." The formal investigation began 3 days after the confrontation in the personnel office. Major Jennifer Walsh from the Inspector General's office arrived at Fort Braxton with a reputation for thoroughness and fairness. She had handled dozens of harassment cases throughout her career and understood both the complexities of military hierarchies and the courage required for soldiers to report misconduct by their superiors. Sarah's first formal interview lasted nearly 4 hours. Major Walsh guided her through every incident she could remember, asking for specific details about dates, witnesses, and the exact nature of Rebecca's behavior. The process was emotionally draining, forcing Sarah to relive months of psychological pressure and professional undermining, but she found it cathartic to finally have someone document the full scope of what she had endured. "I want you to understand something important," Major Walsh told Sarah during a break in their interview.
What you've described isn't just workplace conflict or personality differences. This is textbook harassment designed to force you out of your position through systematic intimidation. The fact that it was orchestrated by someone in a position of authority makes it even more serious. The investigation expanded quickly as other soldiers came forward with their own observations and experiences. Corporal Thompson provided a detailed account of incidents he had witnessed, including specific comments Rebecca had made about Sarah's qualifications and belonging on the base. His testimony was particularly valuable because it came from someone who had no personal involvement in the conflict and no obvious motive to fabricate evidence. Specialist Lee offered corroborating testimony about the hostile work environment that had developed in the personnel office. She described how conversations would stop when Sarah entered the room, how Rebecca would make dismissive comments about Sarah's contributions during team meetings, and how other staff members had begun to avoid associating with Sarah to prevent becoming targets themselves. Perhaps most damaging to Rebecca's case was testimony from Specialist Warren, who had been part of Rebecca's inner circle but had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the escalating harassment. During her interview with Major Walsh, Warren revealed that Rebecca had specifically planned the morning confrontation, intending to pressure Sarah into requesting a transfer to avoid further humiliation. She said Martinez needed to be taught a lesson about her place in the hierarchy, Warren testified. Rebecca felt like Martinez was getting too comfortable and needed to be reminded that she was expendable. The goal was to make her so miserable that she would leave voluntarily rather than continue fighting. Warren also revealed that Rebecca had made disparaging comments about Sarah's family background and her right to wear her brother's seal trident. Rebecca said it was disrespectful for someone in administration to wear combat symbols, especially when she hadn't earned them herself. She didn't understand that it was a family memorial, not a claim of personal achievement. This revelation particularly infuriated General Hawthorne when Major Walsh briefed her on the investigation's progress. The seal trident was sacred to those who understood its significance, and attacking someone for honoring a fallen family member's service demonstrated a level of callousness that went beyond simple workplace harassment. Meanwhile, Rebecca was experiencing the isolation and stress that came with being the subject of a formal military investigation. Her friends and supporters had distanced themselves to avoid guilt by association, and her professional reputation on the base had been severely damaged by rumors about the case. She found herself eating meals alone and avoiding common areas where she might encounter curious stares or whispered conversations. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Rebecca's behavior towards Sarah wasn't an isolated incident. 2 other female soldiers came forward with reports of similar treatment they had received from Rebecca in previous assignments. The pattern that emerged was of someone who systematically targeted subordinates she perceived as weak or vulnerable, using her position and personality to make their lives miserable until they either transferred or left the military entirely. One of these soldiers, Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, had actually requested a transfer from her previous base specifically to escape Rebecca's harassment. She made every day a living hell, Rodriguez testified. Constant criticism, public humiliation, questioning my competence in front of other soldiers. I eventually decided it was easier to start over somewhere else than to keep fighting an impossible battle. This historical pattern transformed the case from a single incident of workplace conflict into evidence of serial harassment by someone who had learned to exploit the military's hierarchical structure for personal gratification. Major Walsh's investigation began to focus not just on Rebecca's treatment of Sarah, but on her overall fitness for continued military service. The stress of the investigation began to take its toll on everyone involved. Sarah found herself reliving traumatic experiences during interviews and depositions, while also trying to maintain her performance in a work environment where everyone was watching to see how the case would resolve. She leaned heavily on her victim's advocate and the support of soldiers like Thompson and Lee, who had chosen to stand with her despite potential personal costs. General Hawthorne made a point of checking on Sarah's welfare personally, understanding that victims of harassment often suffered additional trauma during formal proceedings. During one such visit, she found Sarah working late in the personnel office, trying to catch up on duties she had missed due to investigation-related meetings. "You don't need to prove yourself by working overtime," General Hawthorne told her gently. "Your dedication and competence have never been in question, despite what Collins might have suggested. Focus on taking care of yourself during this process."
Sarah looked up from her computer, grateful for the general's continued support.
I keep thinking about what my brother would do in this situation. He always said that when things got tough, the answer was to work harder and stay focused on the mission. I guess that's become my way of coping with all this stress.
Your brother sounds like he was a wise man, General Hawthorne replied. But he would also want you to take care of your mental and emotional health. Fighting harassment is important work, but it shouldn't come at the expense of your well-being. Make sure you're using the counseling resources available to you.
The general paused, studying Sarah's face for signs of strain or exhaustion.
I also want you to know that regardless of how this investigation concludes, you have a place in this military. Your service is valued, your contributions are recognized, and your right to serve without harassment is non-negotiable.
Don't let Collins or anyone else make you question that.
As the investigation progressed, Rebecca's behavior became increasingly desperate. She attempted to contact some of the witnesses, hoping to convince them to modify their testimony or withdraw their statements entirely. When Major Walsh learned of these contact attempts, she immediately expanded the investigation to include potential witness tampering charges. Rebecca also hired a civilian attorney to represent her interests, a move that signaled her understanding of the serious jeopardy her career faced. The attorney advised her to stop making statements and to avoid any contact with other personnel involved in the case, but the damage to her position had already been extensive. The most dramatic development came when Major Walsh discovered that Rebecca had been documenting her own harassment campaign in personal emails to friends outside the military. In these messages, she had boasted about putting Martinez in her place and described her systematic efforts to make Sarah's life miserable.
The emails provided devastating evidence of intent and premeditation that made Rebecca's earlier claims of misunderstanding completely untenable.
One email, sent just 2 days before the confrontation with General Hawthorne, was particularly damning. I'm tired of watching Martinez walk around here like she belongs. Tomorrow I'm going to make it clear that she needs to find somewhere else to serve.
By the time I'm done with her, she'll be begging for a transfer. When confronted with this evidence during her follow-up interview, Rebecca finally understood that her situation was hopeless. Her attorney advised her to negotiate a plea agreement that might allow her to resign rather than face court-martial, but even that option would likely result in a less than honorable discharge that would follow her for the rest of her life. The investigation also revealed systemic failures in the chain of command that had allowed Rebecca's harassment to continue unchecked for months. Several mid-level supervisors admitted that they had received informal complaints about Rebecca's behavior but had failed to take appropriate action or forward the reports up the chain of command. Major Walsh's recommendations included not only disciplinary action against Rebecca, but also mandatory training for supervisory personnel on recognizing and responding to harassment complaints. The case had exposed weaknesses in the base's support systems that needed to be addressed to prevent similar situations in the future. 3 weeks after the investigation began, Major Walsh submitted her final report to General Hawthorne.
The findings were unambiguous. Rebecca Collins had engaged in systematic harassment of Sarah Martinez and, potentially other soldiers, creating a hostile work environment and violating multiple military regulations. The evidence included witness testimony, documented patterns of behavior, and Rebecca's own written admissions of intent. General Hawthorne reviewed the report carefully, understanding that her response would send a message throughout the entire base about how harassment would be handled under her command. The decision she faced was not just about Rebecca and Sarah, but about the kind of military culture she wanted to foster and the standards she expected all soldiers to meet. The investigation had also revealed positive aspects of base culture that gave General Hawthorne hope for the future. Soldiers like Thompson and Lee had ultimately chosen to do the right thing despite personal risks. Warren had found the courage to tell the truth even when it meant betraying someone she had considered a friend. The military justice system had worked as intended, providing a fair hearing for all parties involved. As she prepared to announce her decision on the case's resolution, General Hawthorne reflected on the broader implications of what had transpired. The confrontation that had begun with bullying around Sarah's desk had evolved into a comprehensive examination of leadership, accountability, and the values that should guide military service. Sarah's courage in speaking up had not only protected her own rights, but had also protected future soldiers who might have become Rebecca's targets. Her willingness to endure the stress and scrutiny of a formal investigation had helped expose systemic problems that could now be addressed and corrected. The case had also demonstrated the profound impact of family legacy and personal motivation on military service. Sarah's connection to her brother's memory and the SEAL community had provided her with strength during her darkest moments and had helped others recognize the depth of her commitment to service. Most importantly, the investigation had shown that the military's commitment to equal treatment and professional respect was more than just rhetoric. When those values were challenged, the system had responded with thoroughness and fairness, ensuring that justice would prevail over intimidation and harassment. The final chapter of this confrontation was about to be written, and General Hawthorne was determined to ensure that it would serve as a powerful example of accountability and the protection of soldiers' rights. The decision she was about to announce would echo throughout the base and beyond, establishing precedents that would influence military culture for years to come. 6 weeks after the investigation began, General Hawthorne called a mandatory formation for all personnel assigned to Fort Braxton. The announcement had been brief and formal, stating only that important policy changes and personnel decisions would be communicated to the entire command. As soldiers gathered on the parade ground in their dress uniforms, speculation about the meeting's purpose spread through the ranks like wildfire. Sarah stood with her unit, feeling a mixture of anticipation and anxiety about what General Hawthorne might announce. The investigation had concluded 2 weeks earlier, but the results had not yet been made public. She knew that Rebecca had been confined to base pending final disposition of her case, but, beyond that, details had been kept strictly confidential. General Hawthorne took the podium with characteristic authority, her bearing reflecting decades of command experience and unwavering commitment to military values. The assembly fell silent as she began to speak, understanding that whatever followed would have significant implications for the entire base community. Today I address you on matters of fundamental importance to our military culture and the values we swear to uphold, General Hawthorne began, her voice carrying clearly across the formation. Recent events on this base have reminded us that leadership is not just about rank or position, but about character, integrity, and our commitment to protecting those who serve alongside us. She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. 3 months ago, we failed one of our own. A dedicated soldier was subjected to systematic harassment and intimidation by someone in a position of trust and authority. That failure was not just the responsibility of the individuals involved, but of our entire command structure that allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. The general's words sent ripples of recognition through the formation. Everyone knew she was referring to Sarah's case, though many were hearing the full scope of what had happened for the first time. Sarah felt hundreds of eyes turning in her direction, but, for once, the attention didn't feel threatening or uncomfortable. The investigation conducted by Major Walsh and the Inspector General's office has concluded that Staff Sergeant Rebecca Collins engaged in conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer, harassment of subordinate personnel, and violation of our equal opportunity policies, General Hawthorne announced. Effective immediately, Staff Sergeant Collins has been reduced in rank to corporal and will be separated from military service with a general discharge under other than honorable conditions. The severity of Rebecca's punishment sent shock waves through the assembly. A reduction in rank combined with less than honorable discharge meant that her military career was not just over, but permanently tainted. She would lose all veterans' benefits and face significant challenges in civilian employment due to the nature of her discharge. This decision reflects not only the seriousness of her specific actions, but also a pattern of behavior that included previous incidents at other installations, General Hawthorne continued. When leaders abuse their authority to terrorize subordinates, they betray everything this uniform represents and undermine the trust that holds our military together. General Hawthorne then turned her attention to the broader lessons of the case. The investigation also revealed failures in our supervisory chain that allowed this harassment to continue far longer than it should have. Several mid-level supervisors who failed to properly report or investigate complaints will receive formal reprimands and mandatory retraining on harassment prevention and response. She gestured toward Sarah, who felt her heart racing as she realized she was about to become the center of attention for the entire base. Specialist Martinez demonstrated extraordinary courage in reporting this harassment despite significant personal risk. Her willingness to speak truth to power, even when facing potential retaliation, exemplifies the best traditions of military service. The general's voice took on a more personal tone as she continued. Specialist Martinez serves not only to honor her own commitment to our country, but to honor the memory of her brother, Petty Officer First Class Marcus Martinez, who gave his life in service to our nation while serving with SEAL Team 6. The harassment she endured included attacks on her right to wear her fallen brother's trident, demonstrating a level of callousness that cannot be tolerated in any military organization. Sarah felt tears beginning to form as General Hawthorne publicly acknowledged both her brother's sacrifice and her own struggles. For months, she had felt isolated and questioned whether she truly belonged in the military. To have her service and her family's legacy honored before the entire base was profoundly validating. Effective today, Specialist Martinez is promoted to corporal and will be transferred to the base command staff, where she will work directly with my office on improving our harassment prevention and response procedures, General Hawthorne announced. Her insights and experiences will help ensure that no other soldier faces the ordeal she endured. The unexpected promotion and assignment drew murmurs of approval from throughout the formation. Sarah's colleagues from the personnel office began applauding, and soon the entire assembly joined in sustained applause that lasted several minutes. Sarah struggled to maintain her military bearing as emotions overwhelmed her sense of vindication and recognition. General Hawthorne raised her hand for silence before delivering her final message to the assembled troops. Let me be absolutely clear about the standards we will maintain on this base. Harassment, discrimination, and abuse of authority will result in immediate and severe consequences. Every soldier, regardless of rank, background, or assignment, has the right to serve in an environment free from intimidation and hostility. She paused, making eye contact with soldiers throughout the formation. At the same time, every soldier has the responsibility to speak up when they witness misconduct and to support their fellow service members when they have the courage to report problems. Silence in the face of injustice makes us all complicit in that injustice. The general concluded her remarks with a challenge to the entire command. We will emerge from this incident stronger and more united than before. We will recommit ourselves to the values of honor, courage, and commitment that define our service. And we will ensure that Fort Braxton becomes a model for how military organizations should respond when those values are challenged. As the formation was dismissed, Sarah found herself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters from throughout the base. Soldiers who had remained silent during her ordeal now approached to offer congratulations and express regret that they hadn't spoken up sooner. The isolation that had characterized her experience for months was replaced by a sense of community and belonging she had never experienced before. Corporal Thompson was among the first to reach her, his face beaming with pride and satisfaction. Martinez, you did it. You actually beat the system and made things right. Your brother would be so proud of what you accomplished. His words carried the weight of someone who understood the courage required to stand up to institutional harassment. Specialist Lee joined them, her eyes bright with tears of joy and relief. I can't believe how everything turned out. When Rebecca was surrounding your desk that morning, I never imagined it would end with her being thrown out of the military and you getting promoted. Justice actually worked for once. As the crowd around Sarah gradually dispersed, General Hawthorne approached for a private conversation. The general's formal demeanor had softened now that the official ceremony was complete, revealing the genuine care and respect she felt for Sarah's character and service. How are you feeling about all this? General Hawthorne asked gently. I know the past few weeks have been emotionally difficult, and today's announcement brings both vindication and new responsibilities. I want to make sure you're prepared for what comes next. Sarah struggled to find adequate words to express her gratitude and emotions. General, 6 weeks ago I thought my military career was over. I was ready to request a transfer just to escape the harassment, even though it would have felt like admitting defeat. Today, you've not only vindicated my decision to speak up, but you've given me an opportunity to help prevent other soldiers from facing what I went through. The general nodded, understanding the profound transformation in Sarah's circumstances and mindset. Your new assignment will be challenging in different ways than what you've faced before. You'll be helping to develop training programs, policy updates, and response procedures that will affect thousands of soldiers.
It's important work that requires both analytical skills and emotional intelligence. She paused, studying Sarah's face for any signs of doubt or hesitation. I also want you to know that this promotion and assignment are based on your qualifications and potential, not just on sympathy for what you endured. The harassment you faced was wrong and inexcusable, but your response to it demonstrated leadership qualities that we need in our organization. Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at the general's words. After months of having her competence and qualifications questioned, it was transformative to have them not only acknowledged but celebrated by someone of General Hawthorne's stature and experience. "I won't let you down, ma'am," Sarah replied with conviction. "My brother always said that the best way to honor sacrifice was to use it to make things better for others. I hope my experiences can help create a military where courage is rewarded and bullies are held accountable." General Hawthorne smiled, seeing in Sarah the same qualities that had undoubtedly inspired her brother's own distinguished service. "I have no doubt that you'll excel in this new role. Your combination of personal experience, professional competence, and moral courage is exactly what we need to drive meaningful change." 3 months later, Sarah was settling into her new office in the base command building, surrounded by policy manuals, training materials, and research on best practices for harassment prevention. Her work had already resulted in significant changes to Fort Braxton's procedures, including mandatory bystander intervention training and streamlined reporting processes that made it easier for soldiers to seek help. The transformation in her daily life was remarkable. Instead of dreading each workday and wondering what new harassment awaited her, Sarah now looked forward to challenges that allowed her to make a meaningful difference in other soldiers' lives. Her input was sought and valued by senior leadership, and her suggestions for policy improvements were being implemented throughout the base. Her office walls displayed her various commendations and certificates, but the most prominent feature was a framed photograph of her brother Marcus in his dress uniform, wearing the seal trident with pride and dignity. Next to it hung a letter from the families of 2 soldiers who had been helped by the new harassment reporting procedures Sarah had helped develop. The letter read, in part, "Because of your courage in speaking up and the changes you helped create, our daughters were able to report harassment and get help before their situations became unbearable. You saved their military careers and possibly their lives. We will be forever grateful for your service and sacrifice." Sarah touched her own seal trident pendant, which she continued to wear as a reminder of her brother's values and sacrifice. The symbol that had once made her a target for harassment had become a source of strength and inspiration, not just for her, but for other soldiers who learned her story and drew courage from her example. Rebecca Collins had left the base in disgrace, her military career ended, and her reputation permanently damaged. But, even in her downfall, she had inadvertently contributed to positive change by exposing systemic weaknesses that could now be addressed and corrected. Her attempts to destroy Sarah had ultimately resulted in Sarah's elevation and the improvement of conditions for countless other soldiers. The case had become a model for how military organizations should respond to harassment complaints, studied and emulated at bases throughout the world. Sarah frequently received invitations to speak at leadership conferences and training seminars, sharing her experiences and insights with officers and non-commissioned officers who wanted to prevent similar situations in their own commands. During one such presentation, Sarah was asked how she found the courage to speak up despite the obvious risks to her career and well-being. Her response reflected the growth and wisdom she had gained through her ordeal. "I realized that staying silent wasn't protecting me from anything. It was only protecting the people who were hurting me and ensuring that they would hurt others in the future. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is nothing at all." The presentation concluded with Sarah's reflection on the broader meaning of her experience. "My brother died protecting people he never met, in a place most Americans will never visit, fighting for principles he believed were worth any sacrifice. The least I could do was find the courage to protect myself and others from bullies in my own workplace. His memory gave me strength, but the decision to act was mine to make." As she returned to Fort Braxton after the presentation, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in less than a year. The frightened, isolated soldier who had been cornered at her desk by bullies had been transformed into a confident leader whose work was making a real difference in the lives of others. The seal trident still hung around her neck, but its meaning had evolved. It was no longer just a memento of loss and grief,
but a symbol of resilience, courage, and the power of standing up for what is right. Marcus would indeed have been proud of the soldier his sister had become and the legacy she was creating in his honor. General Hawthorne's intervention that morning had changed more than just Sarah's life, it had changed the entire culture of Fort Braxton and influenced military policy far beyond the base's boundaries. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with courage, truth, and an unwavering commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves. The bullying had indeed backfired, transforming a victim into a victor and creating lasting change that would benefit generations of soldiers to come. And, at the heart of it all was a small silver pendant that carried the weight of sacrifice, the power of memory, and the promise that courage would always triumph over cruelty when good people chose to act.